You know Hobart's waterfront? It's iconic, right? The heart of Tasmania's tourism, that stunning gateway of historic buildings and sparkling water. And smack bang in the middle of it, on a prime piece of land called Macquarie Point, there's a plan to build a brand new, state-of-the-art stadium. But here's the twist. A really detailed risk analysis suggests the real story isn't what they're building, but what's already lying just beneath the surface, a toxic time bomb just waiting for a trigger.
So that's really the big question, isn't it? What does happen when you decide to build on something like that? The source material we're digging into for this explainer doesn't see this as just another construction job. Nope, it frames it as this huge, high-stakes chemical experiment right in the heart of a city. So let's unpack the science, the risks, and the core arguments laid out in that report. All right, so first things first, let's get our bearings. We're talking about Macquarie Point. It's a spectacular spot, right on land that was reclaimed from the Derwent estuary. But, and this is a big but, this prime real estate has a pretty complicated past. For over 100 years, this was the site of the city's industrial gas works.
And look, this is what's so important to get. This isn't some forgotten industrial park out in the middle of nowhere. The proposed stadium is literally a stone's throw from Sullivan's Cove. You know, the finish line for the Sydney to Hobart yacht race, home to all those waterfront restaurants and hotels, and the exact spot where hundreds of thousands of cruise ship passengers step ashore every single year. So yeah, that proximity, it's everything.
Okay, let's get into the chemistry of it. Because what the source argues is that this isn't your run-of-the-mill contaminated site. It's more like a toxic recipe with 4 very specific ingredients that, if you mix them together during construction, could kick off a completely uncontrollable reaction.
So, first up in our recipe, potential acid sulfate soils. The easiest way to think about them is like they're sleeping. As long as they're buried deep underground, soaking in water, they're totally stable. But the second, literally the second, you dig them up and they hit the air, they wake up, oxidize, and start pumping out sulfuric acid. And these soils are all over this area.
All right, ingredient number 2. This is the accelerant, the thing that pours gasoline on the fire. The source highlights this one particular type of bacteria that just loves these acidic conditions. But this thing doesn't just hang out there, it actually eats the byproducts of that first reaction, which in turn speeds up the acid production a lot.
And when I say it speeds things up, I mean the scale of it is just staggering. The report cites peer-reviewed science that says this little bacterium can make the whole thing happen up to 1,000,000 times faster. This creates this crazy feedback loop that also generates a ton of heat. We're talking about documented cases where soil stockpiles have gotten well over 100 degrees Celsius.
Okay, ingredient number 3. This is a nasty souvenir from the old gasworks, cyanide compounds. Now, these are left over from the old gas-making process, and they're relatively stable if you just leave them alone. But the source lays it out pretty clearly. If that super hot sulfuric acid we just talked about gets to these cyanide deposits, it can trigger a reaction that creates deadly, airborne hydrogen cyanide gas.
And for our final ingredient, we've got coal tar. Now, this stuff is this dense, gross, oily sludge. It's what's technically called a DN-APL, and it's heavier than water. So it doesn't just float on the groundwater, it sinks way down deep into the earth. It's packed with known carcinogens like benzene, and according to agencies like the US EPA, it can be so hard to get out that often just trying to contain it is the only viable option.
So you see where this is going, right? The source's whole argument is that these 4 ingredients aren't just sitting there minding their own business. The moment you start digging to build a massive stadium, you risk setting off a really dangerous chemical cascade.
It all kicks off with something simple: digging. That exposes the acid sulfate soils. Then, the bacteria jump into action, basically creating a self-heating acid factory. That acid then moves through the ground and hits the cyanide waste, potentially releasing toxic gas. And all the while, that crazy heat is vaporizing the nasty stuff out of the coal tar sludge, creating a toxic plume. You see? One thing just triggers the next and the next.
So the million-dollar question is, how on earth do you control all this? Well, the standard playbook for dealing with contaminated dust is pretty simple. You just keep it wet. But the source points out a major problem: basic physics. We all know water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So if these chemical reactions are heating soil stockpiles to over 100 degrees, any water you spray on them is just going to turn to steam instantly. The report literally calls it a thermodynamic impossibility.
And you know what? It's the exact same problem for controlling the smell.
The plan involves using these fine misting systems to catch toxic vapors, but again, that intense heat doesn't just make the mist evaporate, it actually creates these thermal updrafts. Think of it like a hot air chimney that could carry those toxic plumes up, and away from the site, and right towards the city, especially on a sea breeze. The source even says these systems could be worse than useless. They could mask the danger, making it smell like eucalyptus while the actual hazard is still there.
And all of this brings us to what is maybe the most crucial claim in the whole report. The issue isn't just that each of these problems is bad on its own. It's that this very specific, very nasty combination, deep digging through both acid sulfate soils and old gasworks contamination, all happening in an open-air site in the middle of a city, is that this specific combination has, according to the source, never been attempted before, not anywhere in the world.
I mean, this quote from the source material just says it all, doesn't it? Because this configuration of risks is apparently globally unprecedented. There are no successful case studies you can point to for reassurance. This isn't a problem you can look up in an engineering textbook. It's a live experiment.
And if you compare this to how they've cleaned up every other big gasworks site in Australia, like Barangaroo in Sydney, the difference is, well, it's night and day. The standard method, the one that's proven to work, is you clean the site first, often inside these giant sealed tents, and then you build. The source says the plan from Macquarie Point flips that whole script. The idea is to build through the contamination in the open air and just deal with it as it comes up.
Now you might be thinking, hang on, what about that Interesc project up in Launceston? They built on contaminated land there. Well, the source anticipates this and tackles it head-on, arguing that comparing the two is like comparing apples and oranges. Interesc wasn't a gasworks site, it was a rail yard. It involved much shallower digging. It was cleaned before they built, and most importantly, it didn't have any acid sulfate soils. That key ingredient, that chemical trigger for the whole chain reaction, it just wasn't there.
So when you put all this uncertainty on the table, the report basically frames this whole project as one massive, massive gamble. It argues there's this extreme imbalance between what could be gained and what could be lost forever. And we're not talking small stakes here. They are incredibly high. According to the source, here's what's on the line. Tasmania's entire clean and green brand, the hundreds of millions of dollars that waterfront tourism brings in, the cruise ship industry, the health of everyone in the nearby CBD, and the very real risk of irreversibly contaminating the iconic Sullivan's Cove.
This is what you'd call a profoundly asymmetric bet. The potential upside? You get a stadium. The potential downside, if the science plays out the way the source fears it could, catastrophic and permanent damage to Tasmania's brand, its economy, and its environment.
And the report also points out that official bodies were ringing alarm bells before the project even got the green light. It quotes EPA Tasmania, which said it was unclear if the plan could actually protect people's health and the environment. It also highlights that the Tasmanian Planning Commission did its own independent review, found the project was a bad deal financially, and flat out recommended it should not proceed.
And that brings us right back to this quote. Because really, according to the source, this is the absolute heart of the matter, isn't it? The fundamental, unavoidable uncertainty that comes from trying something for the very first time, especially when the stakes are this high.
And that really leads to the source's final point, which is all about logic and who's responsible for what. It suggests that in this situation, the whole idea of burden of proof has been turned on its head. Instead of the people pushing for the project having to prove it's safe, the people who are worried about it are being asked to prove it's going to fail. But how can you prove something will fail when it's never ever been done before?
So, we're going to end this with the very same question the source leaves us with. It's a really simple direct challenge. If this method of building through this unique mix of contamination is a safe, manageable process, then where's the proof? Where else in the world has it been done successfully? Because the report's conclusion is pretty stark. Until someone can answer that question, Tasmania is effectively being asked to volunteer as the world's first guinea pig.